In the scorching summer of 1565, on a barren island in the heart of the Mediterranean, a clash of civilizations would unfold that would determine the fate of Christian Europe. 500 knights, old men and boys armed with steel and faith, stood against the most powerful empire on earth. 40,000 Ottoman warriors, veterans of countless conquests, descended upon the tiny island of Malta with one purpose: complete annihilation. What happened next would become one of history's most astonishing military stands, a story so incredible that even today, military historians struggle to explain how it was possible. This is the story of the Great Siege of Malta. To understand what was at stake on that small Mediterranean island, we must first journey back to the spring of 1565. The Ottoman Empire stood at the peak of its power. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, now 70 years old but still commanding absolute authority, had transformed his realm into a superpower that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, from the Crimean steppes to the deserts of Yemen. His armies had crushed Hungarian kingdoms, humbled the Habsburgs, and terrorized the coastlines of Italy and Spain. The Mediterranean, once Rome's private lake, had become an Ottoman highway. But there remained one thorn in Suleiman's side, one obstacle to complete naval dominance of the Middle Sea: the Knights Hospitallers of St. John. These warrior monks, expelled from Rhodes 43 years earlier, had found refuge on Malta, a rocky island barely 17 miles long. From this fortress, they raided Ottoman shipping, captured Muslim merchants, and freed Christian slaves. To Suleiman, they were pirates and crusaders who had escaped justice for too long. To Christian Europe, they were the last defenders of Christendom, the shield protecting Sicily, Italy, and ultimately Rome itself from Islamic conquest. In March of 1565, Ottoman war drums began to beat. From Constantinople's shipyards, a massive armada prepared to sail. Admiral Piale Pasha, one of the empire's greatest naval commanders, assembled 193 ships. These were not simple galleys, but instruments of war, massive siege galleons carrying enormous bronze cannons, transport vessels loaded with ammunition and supplies, and swift war galleys crewed by elite Janissaries. 40,000 fighting men prepared to embark, the largest Ottoman expeditionary force since the conquest of Rhodes. Leading the land forces was Mustafa Pasha, a 70-year-old veteran who had fought in every major Ottoman campaign for 4 decades. Beside him stood Dragut Reis, the most feared corsair in the Mediterranean, a man whose very name caused coastal villages from Barcelona to Naples to empty in terror. He commanded his own contingent of North African corsairs, battle-hardened warriors who knew no mercy. "We shall sweep these Christian dogs into the sea," Mustafa Pasha declared to his assembled commanders. "Malta will fall in days, perhaps a week. Then Sicily, then Rome itself shall tremble before the shadow of our standards." The Ottoman artillery train alone numbered over 80 siege guns, including massive bronze bombards that fired stone shot weighing up to 160 pounds. Each shot could pulverize stone walls built centuries ago. They brought 60,000 cannonballs and 130,000 pounds of gunpowder. Engineers, sappers, miners, siege specialists, slave laborers by the thousands. This was not an army. This was a force designed to erase Malta from the map. Against this overwhelming tide stood Grand Master Jean Perisseau de la Valette. At 71 years old, this French nobleman had spent 48 years as a Knight of St. John. He had been captured by Ottoman forces at Rhodes, chained to a galleor for a year, survived shipwreck, and fought in countless naval battles. His face bore the scars of Turkish swords. His body carried wounds from a dozen engagements. He was lean, hard as iron, and utterly unbreakable. La Valette knew exactly what was coming. His spies in Constantinople had sent word months earlier. He had time to prepare, but what he had to work with seemed pitifully inadequate. The entire garrison of Malta numbered roughly 500 Knights Hospitallers, perhaps 400 Spanish and Italian soldiers sent as reinforcements, and 4,000 local Maltese militiamen, farmers, fishermen, and craftsmen who had never faced a professional army. The knights themselves came from noble families across Catholic Europe: France, Spain, Italy, Germany, England. They had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They wore distinctive red surcoats emblazoned with white eight-pointed crosses. Their weapons were the finest available: Toledo steel swords, Italian armor, German wheel-lock pistols. Each knight was essentially a one-man killing machine, trained from youth in every aspect of warfare. But even superbly trained warriors need numbers, and 500, no matter how skilled, seemed impossibly few against 40,000. "Gentlemen," Lavalette addressed his knights in May as Ottoman sails appeared on the horizon, "the enemy comes to destroy everything we have built, to enslave our people, and to plant the crescent banner over our churches. We cannot match them in numbers. We cannot match them in guns. But we have something they do not. We fight for our homes, our faith, and our brothers. Each of you is worth 100 of them. Make them pay for every inch of ground in blood. Make them remember Malta as the place where the Ottoman tide finally broke." The knights roared their approval, beating swords against shields. They knew death was coming. They embraced it. Malta's defenses centered on three fortified positions. The great fortress of St. Elmo guarded the entrance to the Grand Harbor. Across the water lay Fort St. Angelo and the fortified town of Birgu, where Lavalette had his headquarters. Further south stood Fort St. Michael and the town of Senglea. These positions were connected by walls, bastions, and ravelin fortifications, designed in the new Italian style, with angled walls that could deflect cannon fire better than the old vertical ramparts. But these fortifications were incomplete. Lavalette had been begging the Christian kingdoms of Europe for funds to finish them for years. Money had trickled in slowly. Now, with Ottoman ships on the horizon, masons and laborers worked frantically to strengthen walls, deepen ditches, and mount additional guns. The knights had perhaps 70 artillery pieces, mostly smaller caliber than the Ottoman monsters. They had perhaps 20,000 cannonballs total. They had 6 months of food if rationed strictly. They had one well-defended harbor and 3 forts. On May 18th, the Ottoman Armada anchored off Malta's northern coast. The sight must have been terrifying. Nearly 200 ships stretching across the horizon, their sails emblazoned with crescents, their decks crowded with warriors. The thunder of their drums carried across the water. The next morning, Janissaries began landing unopposed. Mustafa Pasha established his headquarters and surveyed the island. His engineers examined the fortifications and delivered their assessment. Fort St. Elmo, the small fortress guarding the harbor mouth, should fall within days. Then they could bring their fleet into the harbor and bombard the main positions at will. Mustafa made his decision. St. Elmo would be taken first, quickly, to secure the harbor. Then the main assault would crush Birgu and Senglea. He expected the entire operation to be finished by mid-June, giving him the rest of summer to fortify Malta and perhaps raid Sicily. He was catastrophically wrong. Fort St. Elmo sat on a rocky peninsula, a small star-shaped fortress manned by just 120 knights and 500 infantry. Its walls were not particularly thick, its garrison was tiny. Ottoman engineers predicted it would fall in 5 days, a week at most. On May 24th, the bombardment began. 80 Ottoman guns opened fire simultaneously. The roar was heard across the entire island. Stone shot weighing up to 160 pounds smashed into St. Elmo's walls. The fortress disappeared in clouds of dust and smoke. Inside, the defenders crouched behind whatever cover they could find. The walls shake like reeds in a storm, one Spanish soldier wrote. Each impact feels like the earth itself is being torn apart. Stone chips fly like knives. Men are cut down by debris even when the shots miss. We pray, we reload, we wait for the assault we know is coming. The bombardment continued for 3 days without pause. By night, Ottoman sappers crept forward to dig approach trenches. By day, the guns fired until their barrels glowed red. Then, on May 27th, Mustafa ordered the first assault. 5,000 Janissaries and corsairs, the empire's elite shock troops, charged across the rocky ground towards St. Elmo's battered walls. Janissaries were no ordinary soldiers. Recruited as boys from Christian families in the Balkans through the devshirme system, they were converted to Islam, given rigorous military training, and forged into the most disciplined infantry force in the world. They wore distinctive white felt caps, carried curved scimitars and matchlock muskets, and advanced in perfect formation behind their red and green banners. They feared nothing. They expected victory. They met hell instead. As the Janissaries approached, St. Elmo's defenders opened fire. Arquebus balls tore through Ottoman ranks. Small cannon loaded with grape shots scythed down entire files. The knights themselves stood at the breaches, wielding enormous two-handed swords and war hammers. When Janissaries tried to climb the rubble, fully armored knights met them with savage blows that shattered skulls and severed limbs through armor. The Ottomans carried scaling ladders, grappling hooks, siege bridges. They came in waves, each wave replaced by fresh troops. But the fortress's design forced them to funnel through narrow approaches where defensive fire concentrated. Bodies piled up. Wounded men crawled back through dust and smoke. The assault lasted 3 hours. When the Janissaries finally withdrew, they left 700 dead around St. Elmo's walls. Inside the fortress, the defenders counted their own losses: 30 men killed, 60 wounded. They had held, but barely. The walls were breached in several places. Ammunition was running low. They sent urgent messages to La Valette. "Send reinforcements or permission to withdraw. We cannot hold much longer." La Valette's response was uncompromising. "St. Elmo must hold. Every day you survive is a day we gain to strengthen the main defenses. Every Ottoman soldier who dies at your walls is one less who will attack Birgu. You are buying time with blood. It is a price we must pay." The defenders of St. Elmo knew this was their death sentence. They had seen the massive Ottoman siege train, the endless regiments of fresh troops. But they were knights. Death in defense of Christendom was exactly what they had vowed to accept. They stayed. Mustafa was enraged. 5 days had passed. St. Elmo still stood. He ordered the bombardment intensified. Every available gun was dragged into position. For the next 3 weeks, over 6,000 cannonballs smashed into the small fortress. The walls were pulverized into rubble. The defensive ditch was filled with stone and debris. Buildings inside collapsed. The chapel was destroyed. Men lived in cellars and tunnels, emerging only to fight. On June 7th, Dragut Reyes arrived with 13 galleys and reinforcements. The legendary corsair, now 80 years old, immediately grasped the situation. "You waste time and men on this insignificant fort," he told Mustafa. "Bypass it. Strike at Birgu directly." But Mustafa's pride was engaged now. St. Elmo had become a symbol. It had to fall, and it had to fall violently to break Christian morale. Dragut positioned his guns on the Tigné Peninsula, enfilading St. Elmo from a new angle. Now, the fort was under fire from 3 directions simultaneously. On June 18th, an Ottoman cannonball struck a rock near Dragut's position. Stone fragments shattered, one shard piercing his skull. The greatest corsair in Mediterranean history died 6 days later. His death stunned the Ottoman command, but the siege ground on. By mid-June, St. Elmo had endured over 20 major assaults. Each assault cost the Ottomans hundreds of men. Each assault was beaten back by defenders who knew they were already dead men. Knights too wounded to fight loaded muskets for their brothers. Men with shattered legs fired arquebuses from sitting positions. One knight, badly burned when a powder magazine exploded near him, insisted on being carried to the walls each day to fight. "We are beyond exhaustion," one defender wrote in a final letter. "We have not slept more than minutes at a time in weeks. Our wounds fester in this heat. We drink water mixed with blood from broken pipes. The dead lie unburied because we cannot spare men to dig graves. Yet we will not yield. When the Turks finally take these walls, they will find only corpses, but corpses that killed 10 times their number." On June 23rd, 31 days after the siege began, Mustafa launched the final assault. 8,000 Janissaries and corsairs attacked from every direction simultaneously. They poured through breaches like a flood. Inside, fewer than 60 knights and 200 soldiers still lived, most wounded. They fought hand-to-hand in the ruins. Knights in battered armor wielded swords until their arms could no longer lift them. Spanish soldiers fired their last shots and then swung their muskets like clubs. The fighting became butchery. No quarter was given or asked. The last defenders made their stand in the fortress chapel ruins, fighting back to back until they were overwhelmed. Only 9 knights, badly wounded, were captured alive. The Ottoman flag rose over St. Elmo at last. 40,000 men had taken a fortress defended by 600. It had taken 31 days and cost them 8,000 dead and 15,000 wounded, nearly a quarter of their entire force eliminated to take one small fort. Across the harbor in Birgu, La Valette watched St. Elmo fall through his telescope. He had tears in his eyes, but his voice was steady when he turned to his officers. "Gentlemen, St. Elmo has done its work magnificently. They bought us 5 weeks. They bled the Ottomans white. Now Mustafa comes for us, but he comes with a smaller army and a damaged reputation. His soldiers have learned that Christian knights do not run. They fight, they die hard, and they make you pay." In his rage at St. Elmo's resistance, Mustafa committed an atrocity that would seal his fate. He had the bodies of the dead knights decapitated, nailed to wooden crosses, and floated across the harbor to Birgu. La Valette's response was ice-cold fury. He ordered all Ottoman prisoners beheaded, loaded their heads into his cannon, and fired them back at the Ottoman lines. "There will be no mercy now, no surrender, no retreat. We fight to extermination." The siege of the main positions began on July 2nd. Mustafa had perhaps 32,000 effectives left, still heavily outnumbering the defenders, but having lost his best troops at St. Elmo. The bombardment of Birgu and Singlea began, with 70 guns firing simultaneously. For 6 weeks, the guns rarely stopped. Ottoman engineers calculated they fired over 130,000 shots into the fortifications. But La Valette had used his 5 weeks well. The walls had been strengthened with earthenwork backing that absorbed cannonballs. Interior buildings were demolished to create clear fields of fire. Every able-bodied person on Malta worked on defenses. Women and children carried stones and ammunition. Elderly men too old to fight manned lookout posts. The entire population became part of the defensive machine. The Ottomans tried new tactics. They constructed a massive siege tower, taller than the walls, covered in wet hides to resist fire arrows, and filled with Janissaries. It took days to build and position. On June 15th, it rolled forward toward Singlea. Maltese engineers had prepared for this. They had undermined the ground in front of the walls. As the tower advanced, the earth beneath it collapsed. The entire structure toppled sideways, spilling Janissaries into the defensive ditch where they were slaughtered by arquebus fire from above. Ottoman sappers tried to mine under the walls, digging tunnels packed with gunpowder. La Valette had countermining teams that dug their own tunnels, breaking into Ottoman mines and fighting underground battles in the darkness with knives and pistols. Several Ottoman mines were successfully fired, blowing huge gaps in the walls, but each time, assault troops rushing through the breach met prepared kill zones where every defender concentrated fire. On August 7th, Mustafa attempted a massive coordinated assault on both Birgu and Senglea simultaneously. 8,000 Janissaries and corsairs attacked at dawn. Turkish galleys tried to force their way into the harbor to land troops behind the defenses. It was the crisis point of the entire siege. If the Ottomans broke through anywhere, the island was lost. The fighting raged for 8 hours without pause. At one critical point, Ottoman troops broke into Senglea and fought their way to the central square. A small force of knights, perhaps 20 men, led by a French knight named Chevalier de Robles, counterattacked directly into thousands of enemy soldiers. They fought with such ferocity, cutting down Ottomans in piles, that the Turkish advance stalled in shock at encountering such resistance. Local Maltese civilians joined the fight, men, women, even children throwing stones and boiling oil from rooftops. Slowly, incredibly, the Ottomans were pushed back. La Valette himself, 71 years old, took up sword and armor and fought in the breach at Birgu. A grand master who does not fight beside his men is no grand master, he declared. An arquebus ball grazed his leg. He ignored it and fought on. His presence inspired defenders to impossible efforts. Men who should have been dead from wounds stood and fought. The Ottomans were finally driven back with staggering losses. But Malta's situation remained desperate. By late August, the defenders were down to their last food supplies. Ammunition was critically low. Water was contaminated. Disease spread through the crowded fortifications. Hundreds lay wounded with inadequate medical care. The population was eating rats, leather, anything to survive. If relief did not come soon, even if they beat off the Ottomans, they would starve. Mustafa faced his own crisis. It was late August. His men had been campaigning since May in brutal heat. Disease ravaged his camps. He had lost perhaps 20,000 men dead or too wounded to fight. Supplies were running low. Word came that a Christian relief force was gathering in Sicily. Sultan Suleiman sent angry messages demanding to know why Malta had not fallen. Mustafa's reputation was in ruins. He needed a victory desperately. On September 1st, he launched what he intended as the final assault. 10,000 men, everything he had left, attacked Birgu. The bombardment beforehand was the heaviest of the entire siege. When it lifted, Janissaries advanced in disciplined formations, determined to end this nightmare. They carried the Sultan's own banner, a sacred relic that guaranteed victory. They didn't reckon with men who had already endured the impossible. The knights had perhaps 200 effectives left who could still fight. They were outnumbered 50 to 1. They charged. It seems like madness, 200 men charging 10,000. But these were not ordinary men. They were knights who had survived 4 months of hell. They were hardened beyond anything the Ottomans had faced. They struck the Janissary formations like an armored fist, smashing through, killing, moving, never stopping. The Maltese militia came behind them, thousands of men fighting for their families, their homes. The fury of their assault shocked the Ottoman troops, already demoralized by months of failure. The fighting became a swirling melee. There were no formations, no tactics, just savage, close-quarters butchery. Knights wielded two-handed swords that could cleave a man from shoulder to hip. Janissaries replied with scimitars and daggers. The ground became slick with blood. Men slipped and fell and were trampled. The noise was deafening. Gunfire, screams, the clang of steel on steel, the cries of the wounded. And then, from the harbor, signal guns fired. Ships were approaching, sails on the horizon. The relief force from Sicily had arrived at last. 8,000 fresh Spanish and Italian troops were landing on the northern coast. Mustafa's scouts brought the news. He had minutes to decide: continue the assault and risk being trapped between defenders and the relief force, or withdraw and preserve what remained of his army. He chose retreat. The signal horns blew. Ottoman troops disengaged and fell back, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The siege was broken. On September 8th, 103 days after it began, the Great Siege of Malta ended. Of 500 knights who began the siege, 120 survived unwounded. 250 were dead. The rest carried wounds that would mark them for life. Of Malta's civilian population, 7,000 had died from combat, disease, and starvation. But Malta stood. The Ottoman Empire had thrown everything it had at this tiny island and failed. Mustafa Pasha sailed back to Constantinople in disgrace. He had lost over 30,000 men, the majority of his army. He had lost time, prestige, and the aura of Ottoman invincibility. When Sultan Suleiman learned of the defeat, he simply said, "When did my beard become so long that it reached Malta?" He died the following year, some say of shame over the failure. The victory at Malta marked a turning point. Christian Europe, which had watched in passive fear as the Ottomans seemed unstoppable, suddenly realized they could be beaten. 6 years later, at Lepanto, a Christian fleet would destroy Ottoman naval power forever. The tide had turned. Islam's expansion into Europe had been stopped, not by kings and grand armies, but by a few hundred knights on a barren rock who simply refused to surrender. Grand Master Jean de la Valette became a legend in his own lifetime. The new city built after the siege was named Valletta in his honor, today Malta's capital. He died in 1568, 3 years after his greatest triumph, still serving his order. His last words were reportedly, "I have done my duty. Now I go to receive my reward." The story of Malta's 500 who defeated 40,000 is more than military history. It is a testament to what humans can endure when defending what they hold sacred. It demonstrates that numbers, weapons, and resources matter far less than will, courage, and the refusal to accept defeat. The Knights of St. John knew they were outnumbered. They knew reinforcement might never come. They knew they would probably die. They fought anyway, not because victory was certain, but because some things are worth dying for. Today, you can walk the walls of Valletta and Fort St. Elmo. You can see the cannonball scars still visible in the stone after 4.5 centuries. You can stand where those knights stood and look across the harbor where Ottoman banners once filled the horizon. And if you listen carefully, perhaps you can still hear the echo of their defiance, the sound of 500 men who looked at 40,000 enemies and said simply, "You shall not pass."